Some people don't chase money, but mention debt, and something in them tightens. They save quietly, sometimes too quietly. And even when they're financially stable, there's always a feeling that something could still go wrong. Not because they're irresponsible, not because they don't understand money, but because deep down, the idea of owing someone never felt safe. I'm Thomas, and this isn't a lesson about wealth or investing. It's about why debt, more than anything else, still feels dangerous to them. Generation X didn't grow up believing money would set them free. They grew up believing it could disappear and take stability with it. So they learned to hold on to it, protect it, prepare for the worst, even when things seemed fine. You can see it in the contradictions. They'll have savings, but still worry about spending. They'll avoid debt, even when it makes sense. They'll plan carefully, yet never feel fully secure. From the outside, it looks confusing. From the inside, it feels necessary. Because for them, money was never about abundance, it was about survival. And that fear didn't come from nowhere. It had a history.
Generation X didn't grow up dreaming big. They grew up learning how quickly stable could turn into temporary. As kids, they watched adults worry quietly. Bills paid on time, but with tension. Jobs that looked solid, but never guaranteed. Conversations that stopped when children entered the room. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy. Just a constant low-level awareness that things could change, and not in a good way. Money wasn't discussed openly. It was managed, handled carefully, and rarely trusted. So Gen X learned early that comfort was conditional, something you had to be ready to lose. If something felt good, it probably wouldn't last. Calm didn't mean safety. It meant you should prepare. If you relaxed too much, you'd regret it later. This is where scarcity mindset quietly forms, not from poverty, but from unpredictability. When outcomes feel uncertain, optimism becomes dangerous. Hope feels irresponsible. Caution feels smart. So instead of expecting more, Gen X learned to expect less and plan around disappointment. That mindset shows up everywhere. Saving money not to grow rich, but to avoid panic. And control became everything. Avoiding debt not because it's evil, but because it removes control. Debt meant dependence, and dependence felt like vulnerability. Distrusting financial promises because they've seen systems change their rules mid-game. They don't believe the floor will catch them, so they build their own. Not because they're pessimistic, but because pessimism once felt like protection. And that way of thinking didn't fade with age. It hardened, because sooner or later, something always broke.
Here's the thing about Gen X. The fear didn't arrive loudly. There was no single collapse, no one moment that screamed everything is broken. It arrived quietly, in patterns. Layoffs stopped being shocking headlines. Restructuring became a polite way of saying you're on your own now. And pensions slowly disappeared, replaced by 401ks. For Gen X, money stopped feeling like progress. It started feeling like defense. They watched parents who did everything right, loyal, consistent, responsible, still lose stability. Not because they failed, but because systems changed mid-game. And once you see that happen, you don't unsee it. So Gen X adapted, quietly, without ever naming it. They learned to keep an emergency fund not as a goal, but as emotional insulation. Not 6 months just in case, but something, anything, so the floor doesn't disappear overnight. They learned to avoid debt not because it's immoral, but because debt removes exits. When you owe money, you owe stability to a system you don't control, and they learned early that systems change. A credit card isn't spending power,
It's a promise to your future self, one you might not be able to keep if the rules change again. And that's why even manageable debt can feel unsafe, because safety was never guaranteed. This is where something shifts. For Gen X, the pain of losing money feels heavier than the pleasure of gaining it. Not irrationally, experientially. They don't chase upside. Protecting downside feels safer. That's why the behaviors look contradictory from the outside. They'll say no to a new car, but yes to a once-in-a-lifetime concert. Because deep down, they don't trust permanence. They trust memories. And this is the part most people miss. Gen X doesn't expect things to work out. They expect things to break, eventually. So they prepare. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just enough to sleep at night. But that quiet preparation comes with a cost. A constant background tension. A sense that safety is temporary and control is fragile. And that's where retirement anxiety begins to creep in. Not as panic, but as a low, persistent hum that never fully goes away. Because if systems failed before, what guarantees they won't again? What this does to the future is harder to see, but it matters. It shows up in the way Gen X plans for what comes next.
What looks like overthinking. What looks like caution. What looks like playing it too safe isn't indecision. It's defensive intelligence. Psychologists have a name for this. They call it loss aversion. For most people, gaining $1,000 feels good. For Gen X, losing $1,000 feels twice as powerful. Because loss isn't abstract to them. They've watched it happen, suddenly, unfairly, and without warning. Jobs disappeared. Pensions vanished. Entire companies folded overnight. So their brains adapted. Gen X doesn't ask, how much can I make? They ask, what could go wrong? That's not negativity, that's pattern recognition. But there's another layer underneath it. A scarcity mindset, just not the one people usually mean. This isn't, I'll never have enough. It's, I don't trust that this will last. Which is why Gen X saves even when things are good. Why they build emergency funds they hope to never touch. Why they avoid debt unless they can see the exit clearly marked. Debt, to them, isn't leverage, it's exposure. And exposure feels dangerous when you grew up watching safety nets fail. This is also why Gen X struggles with traditional financial advice. Stay invested, trust the system, think long term. They've heard versions of that before, and they've seen how quickly long term collapses when the rules change mid-game. So instead, they learn to DIY their finances. They diversify income, they self-educate, and they keep backup plans for their backup plans. Not because they expect success, but because they expect uncertainty. To outsiders, it looks exhausting. To Gen X, it feels calm. Because control, even imperfect control, feels safer than blind trust. And once you understand that, their money habits stop looking strange. They start making sense. Here's the part that rarely gets said. Gen X isn't broken. They're not pessimistic. They're not bad with money. They're adapted. Every generation learns money from the world that raised them. Boomers learned expansion. Millennials learned disruption. Gen Z is learning instability in real time. Gen X learned collapse, quietly, early, and repeatedly. So they didn't build dreams around growth, they built systems around survival, systems meant to last. Not because they lack ambition, but because ambition feels fragile when you've seen the floor drop out. That's why they save even when it looks unnecessary, why they hate debt even when the math says it's fine, why they'd rather own something small than owe something big. It's not fear driving them forward, it's memory. Memory of watching rules change without consent. Memory of doing everything right and still seeing people lose everything. Memory of realizing that no institution will care about your future as much as you do. And maybe that's the quiet lesson here. Some people chase growth. Some chase freedom. Some chase status. Gen X chases durability, the ability to keep going, to absorb shocks, to stay standing when things don't go as planned. In a world that keeps proving how fragile systems can be, that instinct doesn't look outdated. It looks earned. If any of this felt familiar, you're not alone. You don't need to agree with everything here. You don't need to change anything. Sometimes understanding why we think the way we do is enough to loosen the grip.